We have a panel coming up later this year of the same title, Art in the Commodity Form. So this talk is intended as kind of a primer or something to get you thinking on that subject. Art is not politics, and politics is not art. But the two have come to be deeply intertwined to the point where one is often confused for the other. This is no accident. Art as we know it today, art is a specific field of production, emerged alongside bourgeois society at around the same time in history, the 14th and 15th centuries in Western Europe. In art, this is the moment that we refer to as the Renaissance. The radical shifts in artistic production at this moment would not have been possible were it not for the growing strength of the bourgeoisie, the consolidation of wealth and power in the mercantile class that emerged out of the existing feudal society. It also would not have been possible without the simultaneous emergence of the commodity form. So by way of example, this is a... I like your face, Pam. Yeah. So this is a Flemish reliquary created shortly before the Renaissance. It was commissioned by a member of the clergy and had the explicitly ecclesiastical purpose of housing and elevating the remains or supposed remains of a saint. The name of its creator is unknown. It would not have mattered. In the Middle Ages, sculptors, painters, metal workers were all just lumped in with artisans and other craftsmen. So the concept of artistic authorship would have just made no sense. In this example, we see the ancient or pre-modern, pre-bourgeois method by which objects could be made more valuable, which is put valuable stuff on it. So this is made out of silver and gold. It has pearls and rubies on it. It's precious because the stuff in it is precious. So the concept of artistic value, that the value of a work of art exceeds its material components, is perhaps the greatest achievement of Renaissance art. We often hear about advancements in Renaissance art, like the development of perspective, a more scientific approach to rendering, and the discovery and emulation of the art of the classical ancient world as the defining traits of these period. These are all very important and warrant plenty of conversation on their own, but it's the concept of artistic value as a quality in and of itself that will set the course for the development of art as we know it today.
Do you want to turn off that light that's right above the projection?
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea.
Bear with me until I figure out which one's which. There we go.
Okay. Accordingly, the idea of artistic genius quickly takes hold in this period. The great masters of the Renaissance in both Italy and Flanders painted self-portraits, like this one, which is probably a self-portrait of Van Eyck, that could serve as a kind of advertisement for their skills. Artists traveled and were free to market their work to bourgeois rather than courtly or clerical patrons. While Van Eyck's masterpiece, the Ghent Altarpiece, for instance, is decisively theological in its subject matter, it was commissioned by a bourgeois patron. This emerging class, the emerging bourgeoisie, used commissions like these to establish their wealth and status alongside or in competition with the existing aristocratic order. The other great contribution of the Renaissance was canvas painting. Unlike the previously dominant fresco form, which was firmly anchored to a single site, everyone knows what a fresco is, right? You can't move it around. The painted canvas was portable. It could be bought and sold and traded over great distances. In this canvas by Botticelli, we see a decidedly secular subject, indicating that with the expanding market for works of art came an expanding choice of subject matter. Fittingly, the lives of individual artists became subjects of fascination. This is a cover for Vasari's Lives of the Artist. The anonymous medieval craftsman gave way to the Renaissance genius, an individual of special talent whose signature increased the value of the objects he produced. We can see that even in its earliest days, art and the commodity form and the bourgeoisie were deeply intertwined. These developments of art were dependent on bourgeois patrons, and these patrons, in turn, used works of art to define and represent the character and the expanding influence of their class. Of course, this is not to say that there were only bourgeois patrons following the Renaissance. This was largely still in the hands of the courts and the church, and that continues for several centuries. So we're going to do an art history in really, really broad strokes tonight. So we are now jumping ahead to the French Revolution. Those other centuries, whatever. So it's only when the bourgeoisie comes to political power in the French Revolution in 1789 that we see the next great transformation in the field of artistic production. After the Third Estate, the French bourgeoisie, seized power from the king and the church, they were faced with the problem of representing their new liberal democracy. Until the Revolution, the king, his body, his image, contained and represented the idea of France. With no king, how could they picture the state? The answer that they came up with was really brilliant and awesome. So on August 10th, 1793, which was the anniversary of the beheading of Louis XVI, the Louvre Palace was converted into the Musée du Louvre. Its halls were filled with objects seized from aristocratic estates. In this gesture, objects that once represented aristocratic power were transformed, with absolutely no physical alterations, into objects representing the power of the state. So this is one of the statements about the invention of the Louvre for the Minister of the Interior to Jacques-Louis David, who's an artist I'm sure you're all familiar with. The museum must demonstrate the nation's greatest riches. France must extend its glory through the ages and to all peoples. The National Museum will embrace knowledge in all its manifold beauty and will be the admiration of the universe. By embodying these grand ideas worthy of a free people, the museum will become among the most powerful institutions of the French Republic. And I show this to kind of give you a sense of how central this was to the project of constructing the French society after the Revolution. This was seen as a very important effort. There's tons of statements like this. So the Louvre freed art from its aristocratic trappings, both literally and figuratively, and made it available for the first time really in history to the general public. By arranging works chronologically, it set the groundwork for the concept of art history. So this is also something really new that emerges in this period. From this point forward, the development of art would move in relation to the art that came before it. It created a detached zone of aesthetic appreciation in and of itself. We should note that this is contemporaneous with the foundational texts of modern aesthetics, that is, Kant's Critique of Aesthetic Judgment in 1790 and Hegel's Lectures on Aesthetics in 1818. There is much to be said about these two texts, but we don't have a lot of time. However, this transformation enacted in the Louvre creates a new problem. As art historian Linda Nochlin has noted, the invention of the Louvre already indicates art's impotence by setting it apart from everyday life. The space between these two praxes, art and daily life, will become one, if not the defining problem of modern art. So, at this point in history, the commodity form has fully taken hold. And I made a diagram. It is no longer one of the many forms regulating society, so it's not like you have commodities and the church and the king. It's the big dominating factor. The commodity form is twofold. So, twofold, see? A commodity contains both use value, which is subjective and specific, the part on top. I'll stop trying to point. I think that's a futile effort. And can be discussed as a matter of quality. And exchange value, represented on the bottom with the word object and the things beneath it. A property common to all commodities that is general, objective, and a matter of quantity. Thus, the labor embodied in commodities is also twofold. On the one hand, we have the quality of useful labor, the specific, definite labor put into the creation of specific use values. And on the other hand, there is the quantity of human labor in the abstract. In a commodity society, the relations between men take on the character of a thing. It should be no surprise, then, that institutions like the Louvre should become necessary at this point in history. The display of art took up the task of crystallizing or representing these elusive relationships between men. Art became an object of mediation for relations between bourgeois subjects. It is only after and because of this transformation that truly modern art emerges in the mid to late 19th century. Art historians typically cite Manet's Olympia as the defining entry of this new art, although other arguments could be made. So it's modeled after Titian's Venus of Urbino, so already we're seeing an art that refers to a past art. But instead of a goddess, we have a prostitute. And instead of nudity, we have nakedness. The supple rendering is done away with in favor of an economical use of fields of color, and the painting expresses a self-consciousness of its medium, the working of the fields of paint on the flat canvas. This reflexivity inaugurates the project of modernism. Clement Greenberg, one of the greatest critics of the 20th century, wrote that the essence of modernism lies in the use of the characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence. In other words, this is where we see the emergence of the immanent critique of art. While the success, sorry guys. While the successes of bourgeois society were vital to the art of modernism, bourgeois society had already entered into crisis in 1865 when this painting was displayed. The Industrial Revolution had attenuated the fundamental contradiction already present in the twofold character of the commodity structure. An increase in the quantity of use values, material wealth, corresponds to a decrease in exchange value, human labor in the abstract. In other words, for the growing proletariat, greater productivity did not lead to greater employment and wealth. It actually led to increasing unemployment and poverty. Skipping forward again, only a few years this time. So the crisis of bourgeois society is expressed in the self-negating efforts of the historical avant-gardes. Here we come to the next great transformative moment in the history of art, Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. So for anyone who is not familiar, I'm not sure if anyone exists who is not familiar at this point in history, he just took stuff that wasn't art and then called it art, pretty much, is the gist of it. This is the fountain, it's a urinal turned upside down, and he signed the fake name R. Mutt on it. The ready-mades took the immanent critique of art to its most extreme, stripping all trappings of art away but the smallest gesture of intentionality, proposing the exhaustion of art itself. But art was not exhausted. Duchamp marked a beginning rather than an end. If Duchamp's negation was waged against the concept of modernism, the minimalist artists of the 1960s took the formal model of modernism through a relentless project of reduction. This is what Hal Foster called the crux of minimalism. These artists at once completed and broke with the project of modernism. In reducing modern art to its most basic spatial elements, they burst open a new domain for art entirely, one that is spatial, confrontational, conceptual, and relational. The end of modernism did not mean the end of art, although perhaps it should have. It meant that everything is or might be art. It meant that the old criteria of aesthetic judgments would be questioned or done away with, that art would continue, perhaps indefinitely, in this confused and untethered state. It gave way to generations of artists who naively attempt to outwit or escape the commodity form. As we have seen, the emergence of art is inseparable from commodity society. Art has about as good a chance of opting out of the commodity form as a fish does of opting out of water. Questions and comments?
So if that's kind of where you're grounding this, then wouldn't it, in a way, be a very good thing for like postmodern works and the works that follow to kind of try to move away from that, because you've already created like an origin story there, which is so entrenched with like certain writers who are themselves of a class that oppresses everyone. Like if it's Kant's aesthetics that are grounding that original history of art, and postmodernism betrays this, wouldn't that be like a decent and right thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think my answer to that is that postmodernism as an ideology kind of mistakes the problem. I think that, the reason I went back to the Renaissance and went through modernism and the crisis of bourgeois society is that these problems are still very much on the table. The commodity form is still the dominant structure of society. So postmodernism, as I understand it, is a rejection of what it would call the grand narratives of modernity, and alongside that, kind of a rejection of the possibility of a fundamental transformation. So I think that these kind of escape attempts that art has been making since the 1970s can ultimately only be ameliorative. Does that make sense?
I think it might be helpful to raise the question of freedom and freedom as expressed in bourgeois and modern aesthetics. So again, like if Kant and Hegel are central to this moment that's marking the emergence of art as and aesthetics as a field in its own right, that I think whoever the art historian was who said that this already marks the moment of its impotence or something like that, I think that they're projecting a crisis back on a moment that actually for Kant and Hegel was all about the emergence of freedom and sort of the idea of the aesthetic realm being a potential site for working out the relationship between freedom or mind and nature and the physical world and what exists, right? So as like, for Hegel, this was like a little resolution of the mind-nature problem in miniature that might point towards realization of that freedom in society in a larger way. So that's the sort of like, that's what he takes up from Kant, right? This idea of our faculty of judgment as mediating, right? As like sort of pointing towards not yet realized freedom, or not concretely realized freedom yet in society. And so that idea of like the aesthetic, so the possibility of the aesthetic field being independent since it becomes a commodity, right, rather than sort of beholden to the interests of its patrons, that also opens up the possibility for it as an exploration of freedom. And so I think that's one thing that comes into crisis in modernist art. And so obviously something like the Manet painting, what's happening there is like fields not coming together, right? Well, I was thinking the other Manet painting, the Déjeuner.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't looking at the screen when you were talking. Anyway, so the idea of this aesthetic realm as the expression of freedom coming into crisis and the way that plays out. And so that sort of problem, I think, that what's essential there is like, again, like this fundamental shift of aesthetics becoming a free field and also a field for the expression of freedom. So, in other words, what I'm saying is simply overthrowing that in a postmodern, like, we're done with grand narratives means we're done with the idea of freedom.
The possibility of freedom.
Right?
Sure.
And so I would just add quickly to that there's a very popular strain of theory right now called speculative realism that is explicitly founded on being anti-Kantian. So I don't think those things are desirable. if you want, as you've pointed out, if you want to deal with a lineage that expresses the possibility of freedom, these questions are still very much unanswered.
I feel like this conversation is like assuming a lot. So I kind of wanted to like back it up to like, I thought the elemental part of your question is like, all right, so art is bourgeois, and then people are negating it. Like, why is that a bad thing? And actually, that seems to be like the key. Like that's the key question, right?
Both.
Right? That's like, okay, so, and then Josh was trying to be like, well, because bourgeois society in some fundamental way is about freedom, even though it brings about new forms of unfreedom.
Or at least it makes a demand
Right?
of freedom.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, but like, so what becomes of art in this like problematic narrative of art both becoming self-conscious, but then also, because it becomes self-conscious, it goes into crisis? Like, so what is art for us now that we're just like in the big misery of the barbarism of bourgeois society?
Well, the part of this story that I left out intentionally for this teach-in, largely because there's just not enough time to cover everything, is what happens to the development of art when the development of radical politics and a real left exerting pressure on world history ceases to exist. So I think that the crisis of art, you can't blame this on some kind of internal development in art. I think it's part of the attenuated crisis of bourgeois society and the lack of a political struggle.
But I don't know, Allison, like, haven't you been arguing the entire time that there is like a realm of autonomy within the art object that's real and can't just be like dissolved into like whether it be the good attempts of bourgeois society or its decay and barbarism? Like, I'm just saying not to, like, I understand that as a leftist and as a political person, you're like, of course the conditions of political decline affect the possibility for art making, and yet, like, as somebody who is also doing your work in art and making a contribution within the context of art, like, wouldn't you have to like account for a certain, like, I don't know, whether it be loss or transformation of art from 69 until the present in such a way that you're not just saying, well, it's because the left is dead that art is not self-critical? Like, wouldn't you have to?
Well, I mean, I don't think art is not self-critical today.
Okay.
I think that the problems posed by the present are many and plural. Postmodern art seems to have postmodern problems, which is to say they don't, the grand narratives aren't there. You see trends come up every year, every 2 years, each of them with their own set of problems. So, for instance, I'm sure many of you are aware of the Dana Schutz scandal at the Whitney Biennial.
I don't think you should assume that.
Sorry?
I don't think you should assume that.
Okay. So, right now the Whitney Biennial is up. This is a big show of American art every 2 years. And there's a lot of protest over a painting by an artist named Dana Schutz based on the photograph of Emmett Till's open casket funeral. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy, black boy, who was beaten to death in 1955 after a white woman falsely accused him of flirting with her. And the men who murdered him were acquitted. So there's this really grotesque photograph of his open casket. His mother insisted that it be an open casket. And Dana Schutz made a painting based on this photograph. Dana Schutz is white. People are very upset. So I think many of the issues in art today are not being expressed through art, because that's not an aesthetic question. It has nothing to do with an imminent critique of art. When the people protesting this painting don't even really talk about it as a painting. The problem is that it's a painting of a black boy done by a white woman, basically. So it's really hard to kind of continue this lineage of of self-critical art when our discussions around art really don't have anything to do with art.
I will say that, sorry.
No, that's okay.
I will say that like genres in art have always been subject to the interests of the moment. So, you know, a person who is interested in art will look at the technical aspects of it, the like texture and things like that, but I think for the most part, it's always been about subject. And it's like, it was kind of a big revelation when like things weren't reliquaries, when things were history paintings, or even more so when they weren't portraits, but they were like genre paintings of like, you know, peasants eating food, as opposed to like, you know, some royal person with their little dog. So like the subject matter has always been part of it. I think I know what you're talking about with like art being self-critical in terms of like its own materiality confronting itself. Like for example, the apple by Cezanne, which was kind of, do you guys know about this one? It's like Cezanne, impressionist, like paints an apple. This is like goes along with the rise of photography. Art declares that it's no longer about representing things perfectly, but it can be its own medium in its own right. So like his apple is kind of just like, you know, it's very brushy. And in that way, I think that's closer to what you're saying about art and its materiality, confronting what it is. But I feel like it is still relevant and important to talk about the subject matter, especially in this space.
Sure. I mean, I think you're right, but I mean, with this example with Dana Schutz and the protest, it's not even the subject matter. It's something that exists outside of that painting, which is that people find it unacceptable that a white artist has painted this.
It's all, sorry, but the protest is also that it be destroyed.
Yeah, they want it
not
destroyed.
critically,
Yeah.
Not that we like examine
Yeah.
art and the meaning of art because of the
Yeah.
choice of the subject, but that it be destroyed.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder, what about the non-art that's sort of like quasi-art, so basically mass culture? You know, something like Hollywood is not regarded as high art, it's outside the gallery or outside the museum. And it's clearly completely commercial, completely unfree. So none of the aesthetic theory really applies to it. Yet, all the effects are sort of similar. You know, it's enjoyment, whatever, terror, all the effects. So it's enormously powerful, and it's completely crowded out the realm of high art, which has become a niche. You know, much more than in the beginning of the 20th century when Trotsky wrote art and this kind of stuff. So I wonder if we go to that, we may have to conclude that we have to let go of Kant. You know, this idea that art is about freedom, articulating freedom, and the resulting tension, because I think that's where it comes from. So once we let that go and think art is completely determined, not completely determined, but it's determined like everything else in society by, you know, power and struggle, this commercial process, and we see it's a commodity, but it's not just a commodity, right? It's many different things too, because people make use of mass culture all the time in sort of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I still am not convinced that letting go of Kant is desirable. But, sorry, that now I have to like think about mass culture for the past century. I guess one thing that comes to mind is, you know, this problem that mass culture has supplanted high art. Maybe that's high art's failure to be an expression of society that is relevant.
But
I think
sorry, but what were you saying earlier though, in response? Like I wonder if there is art that is attempting to be self-conscious of itself, but that because of the poverty of aesthetic education, we wouldn't even recognize it. Like because we don't know how to talk
that's
about
right.
it,
Yeah.
right? Like we don't. We don't have like an apparatus for consciousness. The other thing I was going to say is that Josh started, like, I know what you mean about like the freedom and aesthetic judgment, but if anything, art is the most unfree, right? Because it's attempting not to be a useful recreation of society as such. It's like a useless object in that way, and in that way it shows how unfree the world is, because you have to be useful in order to like exist in society. But that's why it expresses a kind of possibility for freedom, because it's sincere about its unfreedom. I would say the difference between something like high art and mass culture, it's not me. Like, I think Adorno would say the difference between something like high art and mass culture is that often mass culture pretends or parades as if it were free, as if like it could just like create things, right? Like they had this genius that it could just create. And maybe like an art, I keep looking at Manet, but actually it's not a good example, but like maybe the Sarah, right? That's like, yeah, like that is like a very unfree object, right? I mean, it's like the building materials for what could be a useful thing, rendered completely useless, and by doing so presenting, I don't know, like illuminating negatively something about our world. But in that situation, you would ask yourself, like, how is the world represented or expressed in the artwork? Whereas this conversation about Dana Schutz and all of this stuff is about the artwork doing something to people, or like, you know, like having some sort of political
causing
propaganda
suffering.
or something. In which case, we're not really talking about art at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think already like in Hegel's aesthetics, he talks about, he does a sort of good sort of like self-critical Kantian thing, since he's like, it's a couple decades after the Critique of Judgment, so he's like, he has to be very self-conscious about this sort of like Kantian aesthetic thing that he's in. And he talks about, you know, he's in the midst of, you know, like high romanticism, and he talks about like all of the other ways that, or like all the other manifestations of culture and all these sorts of cultural objects and all this stuff, and like narratives that are meant to be instructive, or narratives that are meant to whatever, entertain, and all this stuff. And like, so it's not to like deny that those exist by sort of focusing on this narrow category of the aesthetic and rooting it in this like idea of freedom, or sort of like emerging transformation that is sort of like the Kantian thing. But he's like, you know, this is what's fundamentally new about our world, is the possibility of looking at cultural production in terms of this idea of freedom. And so he narrows the category of aesthetic to just that issue, which means that there's a whole range of issues that cultural products could speak to. And I think that's still true in mass culture. Like, we can feel things about ourselves, or be entertained, or whatever, or be taught lessons through cultural production, through mass culture, right? And that was always the case. Like, that's the case for Hegel too. He's just saying there's something new that emerges with the modern world, and it's worth identifying and sort of pursuing and tracking this progression, or this development. And so I think that's why, you know, it's a privileging of a certain aspect, I think, of cultural production. And to the extent to which we might still find it, I think it's valuable and useful for us to still consider it. But that doesn't mean that it's always there, or always will be there. And maybe it's not there anymore. So maybe there's not a point in maintaining that
We don't know.
idea. But
We don't know. I feel like we don't know because we wouldn't be able to recognize it. 'Cause how would we like comprehend the possibility of like aesthetic genius today if that's been supposedly declared a dead category?
I have no idea.
I'll do it.
No, really. I mean, the whole idea of aesthetic judgment has been thrown out the window.
Yeah.
In part because people are throwing Kant out the window.
Mm-hmm.
But
what about things that are, sorry,
Oh, of
they're
course.
like collectives doing things, or like, that are like I went to that dream house at, right, over on wherever it
God,
is.
I love it.
You should all go. The
Could you
Nano-
explain what
the
that
Nano
is?
Foundation
All of it.
dream house. It's just like this. It's a sound and light installation, and you just go, and it's really wonderful. Actually, it's like very arresting. But that's, I guess, like cybernetic art, stuff like that. That kind of posits that like the relationship between man and technology, but in this more interesting way, where it's kind of crossing those bounds, and it's no longer just about a singular human experience. It's about sort of something that can be transmuted across time and space, and doesn't have like an aesthetic form, where it's like an idea or an experience that is meant to move people or have people experience it, and their individual experiences is what the artwork is about. It's not about this form in any sense. Is that like does that have anything to do with?
Well, actually, that phenomenon has a lineage that goes directly back
Right.
to this.
It's a rejection of this,
Not exactly.
Different answers.
They might both be right. But when this minimalist object hits the scene, the situation becomes important, where your body is in relation to this big, really heavy, frankly kind of scary thing. Yeah, so this is theatricality, the art of the whole situation. So what you're describing, that are existing in individual experience, that emerges out of this moment.
You're talking about, are you talking about kind of like the non-importance of the object in a way?
Or even just the non-importance of the artist, like making things as a collective. Can't think of one specifically, but like,
Well, that very dream house is made in collaboration
Right,
with Amanda
right.
Young and Miriam Zazila.
or even like, I can't think of one specifically, but collectives that created works and it was supposed to be about this like entity. that was created.
Fluxus?
Yeah, oh yeah, Fluxus.
Fluxus.
Which is, yeah, and kind of the movement away from the personality of the artist, which is even something that arose from the Sorry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think, you're right, I think collectives do kind of do away with the personality of the artist to an extent, but, I mean, think about, like, if I say Bruce High Quality Foundation, for most people in the art world, there's a character that comes to mind. So, right?
A few.
So, sure, maybe they succeeded at kind of avoiding or evading the individual personality, but it seems to me they just kind of replaced that with a group persona.
But was it ever about personality? Like, with Manet and with these characters? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think there's like a certain confusion, a kind of like liberal confusion about what we mean when we say like auteur. Like, it's not like the psychology of the singular individual, but their capacity, because of, who knows, their capacity to express something true about the world that they inhabit. And so in some ways they're like important, and yet they're not really important. Like, what's important is the work, the stuff,
Well,
the experience.
Spessori's, was it Lives of the Artists? Is about the lives of the artists.
Yeah,
So it's very much about them and not really actually about their work.
as people.
In terms of like how we write about our art history.
But in our moment, like, it doesn't really make sense to me. So there's like different approaches to this. One is to like tell the story of the artist and then draw a conclusion about the artwork from the history of the artist's lives and whatever trauma they may have gone to. That's like one approach to what you could do to the art. Or you could think about the object and the way in which the object, quote unquote, the experience, whatever the aesthetic thing is, how it reflects upon the history of art and what it might have to say about art itself, and what it contains inside itself. And that seems to be like a more kind of appropriate modern.
It is, and I agree with you, but I think that other method, understanding artworks through the specific biographical data of the artist is coming back. Like, I'm trying to, I just saw the Whitney Biennial last week, so I don't have all the names and images readily available in my head, but there was a lot of that personal identity art that's rearing its ugly head again, and that relies entirely on the personal story of the person who made it.
And that's not commodification, right? It's the opposite. That's sort of like resistance in the idiosyncrasy of the artist. Because the artist is like a weird body that has like weird stuff in the past. So they're resisting this idea of the market for things or just numbers. And in bizarre, sort of anti-social ways in part.
But
So
are
that-
these
that's
things...
like a paradox resistance, which is perhaps a dead end.
I mean, are they still not entering the art market? Are they still not achieving success through the economy of critics and art magazines and curators? I mean, I see what you're saying, that it's kind of an attempt to dodge that, but does it really escape commodity entirely? I don't think it can.
Oh, sorry. Got way too excited about that. I was, when you pulled up the image of the Duchamp, and you said all of a sudden art is reduced to its intentionality. It's not so much
That's
about
one
the
shorthand.
object, it's the signature that happens, which makes me think of the very explicit control of authorship in a work is kind of what allows it to be presented in its commodity form, because otherwise it would just be anonymous material that would be thought about differently in a way that isn't art specific, but that is commodity specific. So I think that could be an interesting place to move.
Could you give an example of what you're talking about in this scenario?
When something would not be authored, but it would, so in that case it wouldn't be art specific, but it would be, like anonymous art, like graffiti, something like that. Things like that are still in dialogue with aesthetics in a way, but they don't have an authorship. Or I'm just thinking about, kind of like art that happens anonymously, art that happens without knowing. This kind of notion of outsider art almost, or something like that, where the authorship is questioned, the intentionality is questioned.
So how would that be made available for recognition as art?
I'm wondering why it would have to be. Because it seems to me just as arbitrary to recognize something as art because it has a signature as something that wouldn't be because it doesn't have a signature.
Right. So are you proposing kind of like a dissolution of art?
Always. Duh. I mean, what would be the worst that could happen?
Probably wouldn't be that bad, to be honest. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Why just start an art publication?
Because it still exists, and because it needs...
I think it's going to exist whether you want it to or not, right? Like, it's going to be there, and it's going to be some kind of pestering bad praxis, or maybe it's good and you just don't know it.
So, sorry, let me answer that question better, the why start an art publication. Because art is still being made, and I still think that there's a possibility of there being a possibility of freedom expressed in art.
That would be
So-
so nice.
So I think that it's necessary for critics and hopefully artists to take what they do very seriously in that way.
But is art too bougie to be free?
But
'Cause I
bourgeois
think
is
Like
about
too many
freedom.
bougie artists.
But the problem isn't...
Argument, I thought. I really need you to flesh it out, or else I'm just gonna take it over.
Well,
Like-
flesh, could you...
No, it's
which-
the issue of bourgeois freedom, right?
Right.
This whole presentation has been about the possibility of art to become self-conscious is the fact that it grows out of the bourgeois epoch. Because prior to, it's just tethered to the existing order, and the existing powers. So, of course, art is impossible without capitalism, and it's within this context. But because capitalism is also about freedom, it has this dual-sided...
And transformation.
It has a dual-sided character, right? Like
Yeah.
the commodity form.
I think that you could have a really good art magazine without the idea of freedom. You know, because there's still plenty of analysis to be had. You know, every object, art or not, can be, you know, needs to be read and explained and whatnot. And so, just because freedom is this like point of origin in the story of art history, doesn't mean that that's all there is to, you know, everything that we form under art. And especially the averse reading, right? So reading art strategically and all the multiple angles that you can do that. I think that's more necessary than art.
I think that you can, and that a lot of people do.
Yeah, I think that market is pretty saturated.
And all sorts of, you know, like there's a proliferation of that. But the weird thing is like thinking about art and the commodity form and like what that really entails, right? Which is, this is where the whole idea of like freedom gets sort of entangled here. So it's not like, people read art in all sorts of ways. They read art as like self-help or like therapy, or they read art as entertainment,
Or politics.
or politics, or all sorts of like, there are all sorts of different ways that people's practices can be read and can be performed and done. But one of them is thinking about it in terms of its commodity form, and thinking about it historically in terms of its emergence as the, you know, this concept of the aesthetic as a separate realm that expresses something of freedom in relationship, you know, like the sort of transformative power that we have with nature, and the possibility of reshaping things and reshaping the world, and that sort of dialogue that exists. That's like, you know, that's what's being, I think, to me, called forth in the idea of art in the commodity form.
Yes.
And also the way that,
Thank you.
also the way that that gets perverted into just like exchange, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think anywhere else, if you go to a talk called Art in the Commodity Form, you're going to talk about the art market and commodification and how to resist that. And I feel like there's a lot more progress to be made almost anywhere else. I was trying to demonstrate here that you can't opt out of the commodity form. Yeah, that's society. So you can have collectives, you can make art that isn't an object, you can do performance pieces, you can run around parks naked. These are all things that people have tried and said were attempts to decommodify art or resist commodification. But all of those things are part of a society that is fundamentally structured by the commodity form. That's not to say it has to be that way forever. That's why we study the history of the left. That's why we look to the possibility of socialist politics. But as it stands, one work of art is not going to undo bourgeois society.
It's very strange. I keep looking at this slide the whole time, and now for the first time I noticed that it's 1917.
Yeah.
And I think like 1917, this is like the bloodiest year of the war, you know? This like puts it in a completely different context. I mean, even if you want to be a puristic, even if you want to say, I make this incredible gesture of constituting artists in this realm that's completely independent from politics and mass slaughter, you know, then like, how is that even possible in that moment?
Well, what Allison said, she said that this was an expression of a crisis in bourgeois society, and thus it expresses itself in the negation of the possibility of art, right? It's that art should be possible in bourgeois society because there should be a realm of freedom, self-making, self-conscious development, and yet World War I throws this into crisis, and this is what art thinks of the world. This is it. Its inability to create something consciously makes the possibility of art absurd. But that's why it's sincere.
I like that.
You were saying, I was like, oh, she ended in 1969, because Allison and I had this conversation about what she was going to say, and she was giving me like a kind of little mini history of art. And you went all the way into the 70s, actually, and you were talking to me about the attempts of land art and ambivalent and this kind of move of like moving away from the object, doing the performance on the ground, doing things. And you know, it's like how innovative the galleries got in absorbing all of that back into the art world, right? Like now if you go see an ambivalent exhibit, you have like everything. It's like the ground that she was part of, and that's like an art object, and like the photograph of her putting, you know, being on the ground, and like that's the art object.
So this is kind of the genius of culture in our society, that even the best attempts to escape it and subvert it are ultimately completely embraced by the institution. Occupy Museums is an artist in the Whitney Biennial. Like,
That's right.
I don't know what could be a better example than that. Well, I guess they finally literally occupied a museum.
There is the case in LA, right, where, I don't know when it was, maybe just recently, where a gallery had to close down because of community protests against gentrification to neighborhood, because they were saying that real estate developing companies strategically put galleries into the neighborhood to gentrify, and at the same time destroy murals which are communal and anonymous art. So, and the gallery owners wrote like a letter on their website saying, you know, that they were inclusive, intersectional, etc., and they were regretting that they had to close their So I think this is a very different type of displacement, right? It's not within the museum, but this is really like who gets the space.
So you see that as a successful intervention coming from outside the art world?
I'm sure it's only temporary. You know, I'm sure that you can't really stop gentrification away, but it's a different type of fight to have.
Sure. I mean, but I mean, like, I'm kind of glad you bring up the fight against gentrification. Just this past year, there was an exhibition at Artist Space here in Manhattan called Decolonize This Place, and they organized protests against gentrification. I mean, really, like, anything can easily be put in a gallery.
It's sort of interesting, though, the way that, like, the sort of unwitting way that culture and art plays a role in, like, the real estate market, for instance.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, attempting to bring art and culture through your curation in a space or something actually feeds into, like, this miserable process of real estate prices that kick people out of their homes.
Well, this is part of, I think, what you were talking about, or an example of this dialectical freedom and unfreedom of art. That it proposes the possibility of freedom or of new kinds of freedom at the same time that it enacts and reproduces unfreedoms.
So I guess it seems like where the fountain is kind of an art piece expressing the crisis in society at that time, these days is just the whole art market which expresses the kind of continuing impossibility of non-commodified art.
Yeah, that's not too far off.
But this is doing it consciously.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what I mean. Like,
Yeah.
these days, like any attempt to make an art piece which says kind of anything other than society that's based on a commodity form is kind of doomed.
Well-
never gets seen, really.
But the only,
Yeah.
I mean,
There's-
Just for the people making it. Like,
Yeah, I just mean all art pieces end up.
I think there's a couple of factors here. One is that we can't blame artists for what they're incapable of doing because of their historical moment. So it could be that the conditions, I mean, this was 100 years ago. We can't expect someone to make something like this now. Those conditions are over. We have new conditions now. I think, you know, if anything characterizes the art being made at present, it is an explicitly political outlook, and I say political in air quotes intentionally. It tends to rely on other discourses for its own weight. like identity, which we discussed, but also borrowing from the language of the civil rights movement, of feminism, and so on. So, I mean, it's just, when I say that art exploded in the 1970s, I can't emphasize that enough. There, so many forms became available and used, and that inward-facing discourse, that self-critical, self-conscious attitude of the object does not seem to be a possibility today.
But that was thought of as liberation as well, right?
It was, yeah.
The idea of the expanded field, and
Yeah.
that it can become engaged in and sort of speak all sorts of different discourses.
Right, we don't need like the stodgy, like modernist expectations
Yeah,
of
navel-gazing.
medium specificity.
Yeah.
Right, this like criteria that's going to trap us into historical, well, barbarism, which, there's some truth in that, right? Like modernism didn't go so well. The bourgeois epoch didn't go so well. So like
the
it's
stuffiness of high modernism.
yeah,
Of
so it's
course.
like rejection.
It's not expressing anything.
So its rejection was seen as like a freedom moment,
Yeah.
right? It's like, okay, we're free from the grand narratives, or we're like free from whatever. And then everything is up for grabs. What is sculpture? Is installation a sculpture? Could it be a sculpture? And yet, like, while on the one hand it expresses a kind of liberation from maybe historical expectations, on the other hand, I think what you're saying in terms of like an explosion is that like it's completely lost now. Like,
Yeah,
well, what
exactly.
What is
Yeah.
the like driving criteria?
And it's completely given over to the market, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sort of attends it. That it becomes a proliferation of different kinds of commodities, of like niche markets
And now the art newspaper is telling their journalists that they have to have the word Trump in the article, even though the art is not about Trump, because it's clickbait. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's the criteria
yeah, just
for
like
excellence.
almost anything you read, like an art review for the months since Trump won the election, even where it has nothing to do with art, it has to be, in these times, especially today, something. So yeah, it comes out of this turn towards society, but art as a field in and of itself kind of dissipated in that. And yeah, okay, maybe that was lauded as your scarf. Sure, maybe that was liberating. But what's come of it,
My favorite contender in terms of aesthetic regimes is the unlikely return of realism. And I think we see that in cinema, which is dead, right? I mean, there's consensus that film as a serious art form has died in the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century. But we have it in this like bizarre afterlife as long-form television, which we didn't expect.
Sorry?
We have the grand artistic cinema of the 20th century in this like undead afterlife in serious long-form television, which we didn't expect. And everybody agrees that HBO, this is all commercial, it's a commercial outfit, it's driven by commercial rules. So this is even collective and anonymous, right? So there isn't really a grand genius behind this. Yet these things are very effective. Effective in terms of aesthetic effects, social effects, all kinds of things. And I think if you want to sum that up in terms of aesthetic regime, that's realism. Like sort of like a realism with an expanded toolbox.
Yeah, I mean,
even in its return to the serial form, which is very much like 19th century realism, right? Like, it's very interesting.
yeah, Game of Thrones is great. I'd rather watch that than. I shouldn't say that. This is being recorded. Oh, I had a thought for a moment and I just lost it. Does anybody else have any more comments or?
So, I guess it's interesting to leave aside at 1917 because that's like a common kind of date we talk about in Platypus. It's like a kind of splitting off point, and it's an important date in many ways. But I kind of think of it as a splitting off point. So I think it's an interesting political an interesting parallel to be drawn between the development of politics and art after that stage in history. So in the political world, you can kind of see two things which were supposed to be free, which became unfree, like the Bolshevik Revolution, which leads to Stalinism, and then increasing kind of freedoms within capitalism, which is the different type of unfreedom. And then the parallel to be drawn in the art world, I guess, is on the socialist side, there's this attempt to make a kind of proletarian art form, which is similarly doomed because
Misguided.
it is still, when the proletarian art form still kind of expresses the same contradiction of class division. So
Well, so there's two reasons that a proletarian art form can't emerge the same way art emerged along with the bourgeoisie. The first is that as bourgeois society was emerging from feudal aristocratic Europe, they were able to build their own culture within that structure. When we talk about capitalism today, we're talking about a complete domination of society. You can't have a different classes form of culture within capitalism. And then the other reason is that wouldn't be desirable, because the goal of socialist politics isn't to celebrate the proletariat, it's to eliminate the proletariat. So, through that I take the understanding that if we're going to talk about freedom, if we're going to talk about a possibility of transformation, the way to do that is through bourgeois forms, which can be quite radical. Does that answer your...
I guess not exactly, because where I was going was that the development of Stalinism either foreshadowed or is associated with that attempt to develop a proletarian art, which
You mean socialist realism?
Sure, yeah. Whereas the kind of equivalent in the capitalist world is that we've kind of come to a stage where we have in a way a more an art which is more for everyone in a sense, like anybody can become an artist if they want, but it's kind of limited.
If they can afford a $100,000 MFA.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not necessarily true, right? I just mean that anybody can make art, but it's bound to be commodified in a society, so this helps to kind of back up the idea that art is expressing the crisis in society. So in socialism, the kind of art which people are attempting to make, being a proletarian art, can express a crisis within socialism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it expressed
this
this...
insofar as it's a policy, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
Sure.
like it's a crisis when it's like, well, the state's telling you what subjects to represent in the art. I mean, you can have high, you can have like Vertov and Rochenko or something, or you could have like the glory of the peasant in the wheat, and that's a completely different
love that.
narrative. You love the glory of the peasant in the wheat?
That genre, yes.
It's really screwed up. I mean, it's screwed up in a way that it's truthful to why it's screwed up, right? It like shows that there's this kind of confusion
I'm gonna
about
start
what
that
freedom
series
can
now,
be.
and it's gonna be like paintings of people on their laptops with like love our support.
As long as you make them look really good.
Someone please make that.
I will.
Because the problem is that these people were like, it was propaganda, right? They looked glorious even though they were clearly like laboring their ass off and like were not happy. Like,
Yeah.
It was supposed to be the glorification of the proletariat, like the sacrifice of the worker for the revolutionary state or whatever, right? Like the highest like form, what?
Drudgery.
Yeah. So, Allison, socialism is about the eradication of class conflict and the eradication of the necessity of the proletariat. So, art should be tethered into affirming, like, the current state of things and to celebrate it as if it was freedom.
Sorry, I remembered, you mentioned that, ever since the 70s it's been, the market has been the defining, the driver of artistic production,
Well, it
right?
seems like, I mentioned that it seems like attending the liberation of rejecting grand narratives and medium specificity and all that, the liberation of expanding the field and opening discourses, that it seems like suddenly the market kicks into like overdrive at the same time. So it's sort of like the art market.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, like.
Well, I think it's true, and it's also not, because I would argue that, yes, I mean, I just went to the Armory show. It was fucking insane. So the market has a major role to play, but there's also demands coming from artists and arts writers for extra market forces, essentially affirmative action for the arts. And I think that even though the NEA has been pretty crippled and not so significant in shaping the direction of art since 1990, in that period when it was really active up until the 90s, I think that that played a role in shaping what we demand out of art, in fostering this idea that works of art should be justified through how they serve their community or what good they do to the public. So the market, in its strictest sense, wouldn't actually demand that. I think that there might actually be more potential for freedom and liberation in a purely market-driven art world than there is in this kind of social criteria art world that developed in that period.
Which is not just
We shall see. But like I said, the NEA hasn't really been a major player since 1990 after it stopped giving individual grants. But I do think the criteria that it set in place has influenced things like the creation of, creative time, which does all the social practice work, what we look for when we talk about public art today. When artists are applying for grant applications, you need to say, there's very often a requirement that there be community engagement, and this will improve people's lives somehow. And I
They just play chess.
yeah.
Mountain,
Yeah.
advancing the community.
So I think that, arts workers are getting really upset right now about the possibility of eliminating the NEA. But I think that there might actually be some opportunity there in just throwing it totally to the market. Because, sorry?
I mean, it's a contradictory statement, right? I mean, because also we want to live in a society in which more people have the access to funds to become whatever
Of
they want
course,
to be
yeah.
in life. And, I get it. But, yeah, it's, problematic because capitalism is problematic. Because it's
Yeah.
okay, so it's more free than the state telling you what to do, right? But, capitalism is also thoroughly unfair. Yeah, now the money bags are gonna basically make a lot of decisions about where the art world moves and where its financial centers are and what artists it starts to pay attention to. And it's not driven by a criteria or a culture of criticism, of self-consciousness, of kind of advancing a conversation about what art is, but by the new gallerinas of Berlin or something.
Well, yes, but also there was no NEA when this was made. There was...
Yeah.
These people were
Yes, I know, but I'm saying, there was a tremendous culture of criticism and arts publications that existed well before this model of public arts funding and will continue to exist after.
Not necessarily, right? Isn't that what you just said? You just told her, it's not necessary for it to continue. So is it necessary that art criticism continues? Might art criticism already be dead and we just think that it exists because, I don't know.
Oh yeah, I felt that a lot.
I mean, I think that a lot of art criticism is just advertisements for
Right.
galleries. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
What I would more be willing to defend is art education. Never mind who makes the art gets made all the time, but access to art, especially access to past art, is really, really important. Because whatever also the unfreedom of past art was, right, it's deconceptualized. So we don't care about Louis XIV anymore, the aristocrats. We still have the artworks and we can see them. In that sense, paradoxically, this idea of the glories of the past in the museum comes back. And I think that's actually worth defending within even, capitalism.
It is, but I mean, we can't I completely agree, but we have to acknowledge also the contradiction there, because let's say like in the UK where museums and public museums are free, right? And that happens because of the state. That happens because it's regulated through the state. And here in the United States, you have to pay to go into museums. So like, okay, now do we prefer that the state be like the guardian of who gets to experience art? And whether or not if you're in a particular income bracket, you can like spend whatever, $20, $30 getting your family to like see a show?
Well, I have the answer.
You think
prefer
yes?
the UK model, yeah.
Yeah, of course, you say yes. But like, wouldn't we rather live in a society in which such services, whether it be education through art, other things, etc., are made available in civil society that are not mediated through the state? Like, then we wouldn't have like a problem. Anyway, different conversation.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Cool.
Where's the avant-garde?
Yeah, where's the avant-garde today, Allison?
Today?
Where's it at
There's
today?
no.
What about that internet art? I heard that issue is hot.
Don't. No. We're done.
Okay. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you all for coming. I hope you are now more confused than you were before you came tonight.